The Douglas fir that killed Samuel Caldwell was 300 years old. It had stood on that hillside since before the first white settlers came to Oregon, since before the Spanish missions spread northward from California, since before the United States existed as a nation. 3 centuries of growth, of reaching toward the sun, of weathering storms that would have broken lesser trees. And on a Tuesday morning in April of 1885, a crosscut saw in the hands of 2 tired men found the weakness in its heart, and the great tree began to fall. Samuel heard the crack before he felt the wind of its descent. He had been a logger for 40 years, since he was 15 years old and strong enough to swing an axe. He knew the sound of a tree beginning its journey to earth. He knew the way the forest went silent in that moment, as if holding its breath. And he knew with the certainty that comes only at the end that he would not be fast enough. The tree caught him across the chest, not squarely, not with its full weight, or there would have been nothing left to bury, but enough. Enough to break what could not be mended, to crush what 40 years of hard labor had built, to end what had begun on a summer evening in 1860 when a young man with sawdust in his hair asked a farmer's daughter to dance. He lived for 11 minutes after they pulled the branches away. Miriam reached him before he stopped breathing. Someone had run to fetch her from the cabin, where she had been preparing the midday meal, and she had come down the mountain trail faster than a woman of 44 should have been able to move her skirts gathered in her fists, her heart already breaking with the knowledge of what she would find. Samuel's eyes found hers as she knelt beside him in the mud and sawdust. Blood flecked his lips, and his breathing had the wet, rattling quality that Miriam had heard once before, when her father lay dying of the consumption that had taken him at 52. But Samuel's eyes were clear. Whatever pain he felt, he had set it aside for these final moments, the way he had always set aside his own needs when there was something more important to attend to. He could not speak above a whisper. Miriam bent close, her ear nearly touching his lips, her hand gripping his with a strength that surprised them both. "I love you," he said. Those 3 words, spoken 1,000 times across 25 years of marriage, now carried the weight of everything they had been to each other. Every morning she had risen before dawn to make his coffee. Every evening he had returned from the forest to find her waiting on the porch. Every hardship they had weathered together, every joy they had shared, every ordinary moment that had seemed so small at the time, and now revealed itself as the very substance of a life well lived. Miriam could not speak. She pressed her forehead to his, feeling the last warmth of his skin, the slowing rhythm of his heart. "Forgive the tree," he whispered. His final words, a request that seemed absurd until she understood what he meant. Do not carry hatred. Do not let bitterness take root in the soil of your grief. The tree did what trees do. It fell. And I was standing where I should not have been standing. She held him until his chest stopped moving. She held him while the other loggers stood in awkward silence, their hats in their hands, their eyes fixed on the ground. She held him until the foreman touched her shoulder and said, quiet and gentle, "Ma'am, we need to move him now." The logging company sent a man to her cabin 3 days after the funeral. He wore a suit that did not fit him well and carried an envelope that he handled as if it might explode. His name was Patterson, and he had clearly been chosen for this task because he was new to the company and could not refuse. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, standing on her porch with his hat crushed in his hands, "the company wishes to express its condolences for your loss. Miriam looked at him. She had not slept more than an hour at a time since Samuel died. Her eyes were dry now, because she had exhausted her supply of tears. But the grief had not diminished. It had simply changed form, becoming something harder, something that would take years to soften into memory. "The company has authorized me to present you with this." Patterson held out the envelope. "A conscience payment, ma'am. $200. The words hung in the air between them. Conscience payment. As if $200 could purchase absolution. As if money could fill the space where Samuel had been. She took the envelope without counting the bills inside. She would count them later alone, and she would find exactly $200 in notes of various denominations, slightly worn, as if they had passed through many hands before reaching hers. She would wonder briefly if other widows had held these same bills, if this money made a regular circuit from the company safe to the pockets of grieving women and back again. "Thank you," she said, because there was nothing else to say. Patterson's face showed relief, then something that might have been shame. "Ma'am, if there's anything else the company can do." "There is not," Miriam said, and she closed the door. She gave herself 1 week to grieve. It was not enough time. A century would not have been enough time. But Miriam Caldwell had been raised by people who understood that grief, like any other season, had to be endured rather than indulged. Her mother, Ruth, had buried 3 children before they reached their 5th birthdays, and had continued to put food on the table and clothes on the backs of those who survived. Her grandmother had walked from Tennessee to Oregon with a husband who died of fever 3 weeks before they reached the Willamette Valley, and she had finished the journey alone, pregnant with Ruth, carrying everything she owned on her back. Miriam came from women who did not stop when the world told them to. On the 8th day after Samuel's death, she rose before dawn and began to plan. The cabin they had shared for 15 years was a rented structure on company land. With Samuel gone, her right to occupy it would expire at the end of the month. She had no children to take her and no family remaining in the valley. Her parents were dead. Her one sister had married a man from California and disappeared into the southern reaches of that state, sending letters once a year at Christmas that grew shorter with each passing season until they stopped coming entirely. She had $200. She had the furniture and household goods that she and Samuel had accumulated across their years together. She had a sorrel mare named Maple Old, but strong, that Samuel had purchased for her birthday 5 years ago. And she had knowledge. The knowledge was worth more than all the rest combined. Miriam's mother had been a master of preservation. Ruth had grown up on a fruit farm in the Willamette Valley, surrounded by orchards that produced apples and pears and cherries in quantities that staggered the imagination. The challenge was never growing the fruit. The challenge was keeping it. In a world without refrigeration, without canning factories, without the modern conveniences that later generations would take for granted, the difference between prosperity and starvation often came down to a single question. Could you make summer last through winter? Ruth could. Her mother before her could. And they had taught Miriam. The art of drying fruit was simple in principle and demanding in practice. You took the bounty of the harvest season, when fruit fell from trees faster than it could be eaten, and you transformed it into something that would endure. You removed the water that made fruit soft and perishable, leaving behind the sugars and fibers and nutrients that the human body needed to survive. Done properly, dried fruit would last for years. Done improperly, it would mold or rot or become so hard that it broke teeth rather than nourishing bodies. Miriam had been doing it properly since she was 12 years old. She spread a map of Oregon on the table in her cabin and studied it by lamplight. She was not looking for good farmland. She could not afford good farmland, and she did not want it. She was looking for something very specific: hillsides, east-facing slopes that would catch the morning sun and hold it through the midday hours, places where the afternoon breeze swept through, reliably carrying away moisture, creating the natural airflow that made drying possible without excessive heat. And fruit, wild fruit. The abandoned orchards and untended berry patches and forgotten groves that dotted the Oregon wilderness, planted by settlers who had moved on or died or simply lost interest, leaving their trees to grow unpruned and their harvests to fall ungathered and rot on the ground. Her finger stopped on a small dot labeled Pinewood. She knew the name. Samuel had mentioned it once or twice, a small logging town in the foothills of the Cascades, remote and unremarkable. 260 souls according to the most recent census, though that number would fluctuate with the seasons as loggers came and went. A single general store, a sawmill, a church, the basic infrastructure of frontier civilization, and nothing more. What interested Miriam was not the town. It was the land around it. The hills surrounding Pinewood were thick with wild fruit. Crab apples and wild plums grew in the clearings where the forest had been logged and not yet replanted. Huckleberries carpeted the high meadows. Blackberry brambles choked every fence line and abandoned homestead. And the old orchards planted by the first settlers' trees that had been neglected for years, their branches unpruned and their fruit falling ungathered, still produced abundantly each autumn. Pinewood was drowning in fruit that nobody valued. Miriam valued it. She sold the furniture for what she could get, which was not much. She kept only what she could carry in the wagon she purchased with part of Samuel's conscience money. A bed frame that could be disassembled and reassembled. A cast-iron stove that weighed more than she did, but that she refused to leave behind. Her kitchen implements, her sewing supplies, her books. The quilt her grandmother had made, faded now but still warm. And the tools of her mother's trade. The drying frames, the cheesecloth screens, the wooden boxes lined with cedar to repel insects and moisture. The knowledge passed down through 3 generations of women of how to make summer last. She arrived in Pinewood on a September afternoon when the light was golden and the air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The town was smaller than she had expected. A single main street, unpaved and rutted, lined with wooden buildings that leaned against each other, as if too tired to stand alone. The general store dominated one end of the street, a 2-story structure with a false front that made it appear grander than it was. The sawmill occupied the other end, its great blade silent now in the afternoon lull, but the air around it still thick with the smell of fresh-cut timber. Between these 2 anchors of commerce lay the rest of Pinewood. A church with a steeple that needed painting. A blacksmith's forge that glowed red in the afternoon shadows. A saloon with swinging doors and the sound of men's voices within. A scattering of houses, some well-maintained, and others sagging toward the earth, their gardens overgrown, and their fences broken. Miriam drove her wagon slowly down the main street, and she felt the eyes of the town upon her. A woman alone, a widow clearly from the black dress she still wore, arriving with a wagon full of possessions and no man to speak for her, to explain her presence, to vouch for her character. In 1885, in a town like Pinewood, such a woman was an anomaly, a curiosity, a problem to be solved or a threat to be contained. She stopped her wagon in front of the general store. The sign above the door read, "Harmon's Mercantile," in letters that had once been gold, but had faded to a sickly yellow. Below the sign in smaller letters was the promise, "Everything you need." Miriam would learn soon enough how flexible the word everything could be, and how much profit could be extracted from a town's dependence on a single supplier. She climbed down from the wagon, her joints stiff from the long journey, and pushed open the door. The interior of Harmon's Mercantile smelled of coffee and tobacco, and the peculiar mustiness of goods that had traveled long distances in warehouses and rail cars before reaching their final destination. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, stocked with everything from flour and sugar to bolts of fabric, to patent medicines promising cures for ailments both real and imagined. A glass case near the counter displayed knives and watches and other small valuables. And behind the counter, watching her with small, shrewd eyes, stood Fletcher Harmon. He was a stout man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a red beard that he kept trimmed close to his jaw, and hands that were surprisingly delicate for a man of his build. He wore a white apron over his shirt and vest, and he held a pencil behind his ear in the manner of a man who spent more time calculating than laboring. "Help you?" he asked. His voice was neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile, the voice of a businessman assessing a potential customer. "I am looking for land," Miriam said. "A small parcel, 5 acres or so. Hillside property, preferably east-facing." Harmon's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're looking to homestead, I'm looking to buy. I have cash." The mention of cash changed something in Harmon's expression. His eyes became more focused, more calculating. "Land's not hard to come by around here," he said. "Depends on what you want it for. I want a dry fruit." The silence that followed was not hostile, but it was heavy with confusion. Harmon stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "Dry fruit," he repeated. "Yes, there is wild fruit in these hills that goes unharvested each year. I intend to collect it and preserve it." Harmon set down the pencil he had been holding and leaned forward on the counter. "Ma'am, I don't know where you've come from or what you've been told, but there's no market for dried fruit around here. When folks want dried fruit, they buy it from me. Proper dried fruit shipped from Portland, packaged and labeled by companies that know what they're doing. I do not intend to sell it here," Miriam said. "Not at first. I intend to store it." Another silence. Then Harmon laughed, a short, sharp sound that contained no warmth. "Store it. You want to buy land and build some kind of fruit storage operation? I want to buy land and build a drying shed. The storage will be secondary." Harmon shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a child who has said something foolish. "Ma'am, I don't know your situation, and frankly, it's none of my business. But I'll give you some free advice. Whatever money you have, you'd be better served spending it on a ticket back to wherever you came from. This is logging country. There's no future in fruit." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I would like to know who in this town sells land." Harmon's expression hardened slightly. the warmth of his condescension cooling into something more professional. "You'll want to speak to Jasper Thornton. He owns the mill and half the property in the valley. If there's land to be had, he's the one to see." "Thank you," Miriam said, and she turned and walked out of the store without purchasing anything. Jasper Thornton was a tall man who had gone soft in the middle but still carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His office was attached to the sawmill, a small wooden structure that vibrated slightly when the great blade was running. The walls were covered with maps of the surrounding forest, each one marked with colored pins, indicating stands of timber to be cut, roads to be built, streams to be dammed or diverted. It was the office of a man who saw the natural world as a resource to be extracted, measured, and converted into profit. He listened to Miriam's request with the patient condescension of a man entertaining a fool. 5 acres on the east hillside, he repeated when she had finished. "That's rough country, Mrs. Caldwell. Steep, rocky, no good for farming or grazing. Even the timber's not worth harvesting up there, too hard to get the logs down." "I am aware of that," Miriam said. "That is why I expect the price to be reasonable." Thornton leaned back in his chair and studied her. He was not a cruel man, not precisely, but he had spent his life in a world where weakness was exploited and sentiment was a luxury that working people could not afford. A widow wanting to buy useless land to dry fruit made no sense to him, and things that made no sense made him suspicious. "What's your real game here?" he asked. "I have no game. I want to buy land, build a drying shed, and preserve the wild fruit that grows in these hills. You're talking about a lot of work for very little return. I am talking about my business, not yours." Thornton's eyebrows rose at her tone. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "A woman with some bark on her," he said. "I like that. Most widows who come through here are looking for someone to take care of them. You're looking to take care of yourself." "I am." He named a price. $30 for 5 acres on the east hillside above town. It was more than the land was worth, but less than Miriam had expected to pay. She agreed without haggling, and Thornton's smile widened, showing teeth that were stained with tobacco. "You'll regret this purchase inside of a year," he said as he prepared the deed. "That hillside's only good for one thing, and that's watching the town below and feeling sorry for yourself." "We shall see," Miriam said. She paid him in cash, and he counted the bills twice before locking them in his safe. When she left his office, the deed folded carefully in her pocket. She could hear him laughing to someone inside. Something about a crazy widow and a hillside full of rocks. She built the drying shed first. It took her 3 weeks working alone except for the few occasions when she hired labor from the town. The men she hired were skeptical and sometimes mocking, but they took her money and did the work she asked, and that was all she required of them. The shed was a long, narrow structure, 24 feet by 10 oriented, so that its length ran east to west. The walls were made of wooden slats, spaced an inch apart, allowing air to flow freely through the interior, while keeping out rain and large animals. The roof was cedar shakes steeply pitched to shed water and snow. A small door at each end created a channel for airflow when both were opened, and a larger door on the south side allowed easy access for loading and unloading. Inside, she installed wooden racks at 3 levels, waist height, shoulder height, and overhead. Each level was fitted with frames of cheesecloth, stretched taut over pine borders. Frames that could be slid in and out like drawers. The cheesecloth allowed air to circulate around the fruit from all sides, speeding the drying process and preventing mold. At the west end of the shed, she built a small stone hearth, not for cooking but for supplemental heat on the wet autumn days when the sun alone could not finish the work. The key to successful drying, her mother had taught her, was gentle heat and steady airflow. Too much heat cooked the fruit rather than drying it, destroying the very nutrients that made preserved fruit worth eating. The cabin came second. It was modest by any standard. A single room 16 feet square with a sleeping loft above, and a field stone hearth that served for both cooking and heating. A covered porch on the east side where she could sit in the mornings and watch the sun rise over the mountains. A lean-to stable on the north side for maple, snug and dry, with room for hay storage and a small paddock. The total cost of land, shed, cabin, and stable came to $74. She had $126 remaining. She began harvesting that first autumn. The wild plums were ready first, their purple skins dusty with bloom, their flesh sweet and yielding. She found them in the creek bottoms below her property, growing in thickets so dense that she had to cut her way through with a machete. She filled baskets until her arms ached, then loaded the baskets onto the wooden sled she had built for Maple to pull, and hauled them up the hill to her shed. The preparation was methodical. Each plum was washed in cold water from the creek, then halved with a sharp knife, the pit removed and discarded. The halves were laid on the drying frames, cut side up so the moisture could escape gradually evenly, without the fruit becoming tough or leathery. Within a week, she had her first completed batch. 40 pounds of dried plums reduced from nearly 200 pounds of fresh fruit. She packed them in cloth sacks, placed the sacks in wooden boxes lined with cedar, sealed the boxes and labeled them with the date. September 1885. The first entry in what would become a long and meticulous ledger. The apples came next. The abandoned orchards Miriam had spotted on her initial survey of the area proved even more productive than she had hoped. The trees had not been pruned in years and their branches grew wild and tangled, but they still produced fruit in abundance. Much of it fell to the ground and rotted food for deer and birds and insects, but enough remained on the branches for Miriam to fill her baskets day after day. Apple preparation required more steps than plums. Each apple had to be cored and peeled, then sliced to a uniform thickness 1/4 inch, no more, no less. The slices were dipped briefly in salted water to prevent browning, then laid on the drying frames in neat rows, each slice slightly overlapping the next. The drying took longer than the plums. Apples held more moisture, and the autumn days were growing shorter. But Miriam was patient, and she had planned for this. On cloudy days, she lit a small fire in the stone hearth, keeping the temperature in the shed just warm enough to continue the drying process without cooking the fruit. By late October, she had completed her first 40 pounds of dried apple rings. She brought a sample to town. Harmon's Mercantile was busy that morning, farmers and loggers stocking up before the first hard freeze. Miriam waited until the rush had passed, then approached the counter where Fletcher Harmon stood reviewing his inventory ledger. She placed a small cloth bag on the counter. "Apple rings," she said. "Dried this autumn from fruit harvested within 5 miles of this store." Harmon opened the bag with an expression of theatrical reluctance. He withdrew a single ring, held it up to the light, sniffed it, bent it between his thick fingers. The ring was supple but not soft golden brown, fragrant with the concentrated sweetness of the fruit. "Homemade," he said. The word carried a weight of dismissal. "Made in my shed on my property with my labor. I would like to sell it. I told you when you first came here, Mrs. Caldwell. I stock everything this town needs, including dried fruit when the supply train brings it from Portland. Proper dried fruit, processed by proper companies, in proper packaging." He pushed the bag back across the counter. "What you have here is—" He searched for a word, homemade. People want what they know. They want labels and brands, not something cooked up in a shed by a widow with time on her hands. "It is not cooked," Miriam said. Her voice remained level. "It is dried. There is a considerable difference." The answer is no. I was not asking you to stock it. I was hoping to set up a table outside your store on market days. I would handle my own sales. You would simply allow me to use the space. Harmon's small eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is my establishment. My customers come here expecting a certain standard. If I allow every farmer's wife and homesteader's widow to set up shop outside my door, what does that say about my merchandise? It says that you serve the community rather than yourself." The words hung in the air. Harmon's face reddened above his beard. "The answer," he said, his voice dropping to something cold and hard, "is no. You may not set up outside my store. It would give the wrong impression." Miriam took back her bag of apple rings. What impression would that be? The impression that Harmon's mercantile needs help from a woman drying fruit in a shack on a hillside. Harmon turned back to his ledger. "Good day, Mrs. Caldwell." The wrong impression spread quickly. Within a week, everyone in Pinewood knew about the widow on the hill and her peculiar enterprise. The story passed from Fletcher Harmon to his customers, from his customers to their families. From the families to the logging crews and the mill workers and the farmers who came to town for supplies. With each retelling, the story grew more colorful. The widow had lost her mind from grief, some said. The death of her husband had unbalanced her, driven her to this strange obsession with fruit. Others suggested that she was not a widow at all, but a woman fleeing some scandal in the valley below. Why else would she come alone to a logging town where she knew no one buy worthless land and set up an operation that made no economic sense? Jasper Thornton heard the gossip and added his own embellishments at the saloon where he held court most evenings, among the mill workers and timber bosses. 5 acres of rocks and scrub, he announced loud enough for the whole room to hear. Paid $30 for it like it was prime bottom land. And now she's up there drying fruit. Hundreds of pounds of the stuff, if you can believe it. He shook his head in wonderment. The woman has clearly been affected by her loss. Drying fruit by the hundreds of pounds. It borders on mania. His wife Cordelia spread the story through different channels. Cordelia Thornton was the informal leader of Pinewood's respectable women. She organized the church socials, led the women's auxiliary, and determined through the subtle mechanisms of invitation and exclusion who belonged to polite society and who did not. A widow living alone on a hillside, engaged in manual labor that left her hands rough and her clothes stained with fruit juice, clearly did not belong. She called a meeting of the women's auxiliary to discuss the matter. "I am not saying we should be unkind," Cordelia told the assembled women, "but we have a responsibility to maintain standards. This Mrs. Caldwell has set up some sort of drying operation in a shed on the hillside. An open-air shed, mind you, where birds and insects have free access. The health implications alone should concern us all." The women nodded and murmured their agreement. "And then there is the matter of her manner," Cordelia continued. "I am told that she spoke quite sharply to Fletcher Harmon when he declined to support her little venture. A woman in her position, a widow dependent on the goodwill of this community, should show more humility, more nodding, more murmuring. I propose," Cordelia said, "that we extend no formal welcome to Mrs. Caldwell until she demonstrates that her activities and her character are in keeping with the standards of this community. We will not be rude. We will simply wait and see." The proposal passed unanimously. By the end of October, Miriam's shed had acquired a name: the Widow's Madhouse. She first heard it from one of the Hill families who lived higher up the valley, a clan of subsistence farmers who had little contact with the town below, and even less interest in its opinions. The youngest daughter of this family, a girl of about 12 named Sarah, had taken to visiting Miriam's cabin on her way down to the valley to gather nuts. "They call it the Widow's Madhouse," Sarah told her one afternoon, watching with fascination as Miriam sliced apples with the quick, precise movements of long practice. "I heard my pa say it. He said the whole town thinks you're crazy." Miriam did not stop slicing. "And what do you think?" Sarah considered the question seriously, the way children do when they realize they are being treated as equals. "I think your apple rings taste better than anything Mr. Harmon sells. And I think if storing food for winter is crazy, then my ma is crazy too. And she's the smartest person I know." Miriam smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since Samuel's death. "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman. I should like to meet her." The meeting led to an arrangement. Miriam would trade finished dried fruit for access to the wild huckleberry patches that grew on the family's land, too high and too remote for her to reach efficiently on her own. The family in turn gained a source of preserved food that supplemented their own stores. It was the first of several such arrangements that Miriam would make in the years to come. The mockery continued through that first winter, and into the following spring. Miriam heard it all. The jokes at the saloon reported to her by the few townspeople willing to speak with her. The sermons at the church which she did not attend, but which she learned about through the Hill families. Sermons about the dangers of pride and isolation and the importance of community. The whispered comments when she came to town to purchase supplies. Comments that stopped just as she came within earshot and resumed as soon as she passed. She did not respond. She did not defend herself. She did not explain her methods or her reasoning or her plans. She simply continued to work. The spring of 1886 brought new growth to her hillside. She planted 4 apple trees and 3 pear tree saplings purchased from a nursery in Portland that arrived wrapped in burlap and looking half dead from the journey. She watered them carefully, protected them from deer with wire cages, and waited for them to take root. They would not bear fruit for years, but Miriam was planning for years. She was planning for decades. She cultivated blackberry canes along her fence line, training them on trellises that maximized sun exposure and made harvesting easier. She established a small garden for vegetables not to dry, but to eat fresh, and to supplement her income from selling eggs and vegetables to the Hill families who had become her only customers. The summer harvest of 1886 was larger than the first. 112 pounds of dried fruit, a mixture of plums and apples and wild berries. She stored it alongside the 40 pounds from the previous autumn, and her ledger grew. The summer of 1887 was larger still, 173 pounds. By the autumn of 1888, Miriam Caldwell had accumulated 512 pounds of dried fruit. 512 pounds. The number became legendary and Pinewood repeated with varying degrees of disbelief and derision. Fletcher Harmon mentioned it to his customers as evidence of the widow's detachment from reality. Jasper Thornton used it as a punchline at the saloon, always good for a laugh when the conversation lagged. Cordelia Thornton cited it at women's auxiliary meetings as proof that Mrs. Caldwell was sadly beyond the reach of normal society. 500 pounds of dried fruit, Harmon said, shaking his head. 500 pounds. Who needs 500 pounds of fruit? She will be buried in prunes before she is buried in the ground, Thornton joked. Perhaps she means to open a shop, his wife added. Caldwell's Dried Goods, specializing in madness by the pound. The laughter echoed through Pinewood, through the saloon and the church, and the general store, and the homes of families who had never spoken to Miriam Caldwell, but felt entitled to judge her nonetheless. On her hillside in her cabin, Miriam heard the echoes of that laughter carried on the wind. She added another 20 pounds of dried pear to her stores, and she said nothing. The autumn of 1888 arrived early and stayed late. The rains came in September and did not stop. Day after day, the clouds rolled in from the Pacific, heavy and gray, dropping their burden on the Cascade foothills in quantities that turned the roads to rivers and the rivers to torrents. The mountain passes, which had been clear and passable all summer, began to accumulate snow at elevations that should have remained bare until November. Miriam watched the weather with an attention that had been bred into her across 3 generations. Her grandmother had survived a winter in Tennessee when the snow fell for 3 weeks straight, and the family ate bark soup to stay alive. Her mother had weathered the floods of 1861 when the Willamette River rose 40 feet and swept away entire towns. Miriam herself remembered the winter of 1873 when an ice storm had stranded her family in their farmhouse for 16 days, and they had survived on preserved food from the root cellar. She knew the signs, the way the air tasted before a hard freeze, the patterns of bird migration that signaled a harsh season ahead, the quality of the light in late afternoon thin and watery, as if the sun itself was preparing to withdraw. This winter she knew would be different. She did not know how different. She could not know. No one could know that the winter of 1888 to 1889 would become legendary in Oregon, spoken of for generations afterward, as the year the mountains closed and the world forgot about the towns that lay beyond them. But she knew enough. In October, while the rest of Pinewood went about its business as usual, trusting in the supply train that arrived every 2 weeks, like clockwork, Miriam made her final preparations. She reinforced the roof of her drying shed against the weight of heavy snow. She stacked firewood in quantities that her neighbors would have considered excessive enough to keep her cabin and stable warm for 4 months without resupply. She checked and rechecked her stores, her ledger, her inventory of preserved food, 512 pounds of dried fruit, enough to sustain a family of 4 for an entire year, enough to feed 50 people for a month, enough to keep a small town alive if the worst should come. The worst was coming. On November 15th, 1888, the last supply train of the season arrived in Pinewood. No one knew it was the last. The schedule posted at the depot showed trains arriving every 2 weeks through the winter as they always had. The railroad had not announced any disruption. The territorial government had not issued any warnings. But the schedule was printed in Portland by men who had never seen a Cascade winter. And the winter of 1888 to 1889 would make liars of them all. In her cabin on the hillside, Miriam Caldwell stood at her window and watched the train pull into the station below. She watched the townspeople gather to collect their goods, their faces unconcerned, their faith in the system that sustained them unshaken. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, and she waited. The first missed train caused little concern. December 3rd came and went without the familiar whistle of the locomotive, echoing through the valley without the plume of smoke rising above the tree line, without the bustle of activity at the depot that marked the arrival of goods from the outside world. The people of Pinewood noticed, of course. They remarked upon it at Harmon's Mercantile at the saloon at the church social that Sunday. But their remarks carried no weight of worry. Delays were common in winter. Everyone knew this. The mountain passes were treacherous when the snow fell heavy, and the snow had been falling heavy for weeks now. The railroad crews were probably working around the clock to clear the tracks, their great rotary plows chewing through drifts that would have stopped a lesser operation. The train would come. It always came. Perhaps a few days late, perhaps a week, but it would come. Fletcher Harmon assured his customers that there was nothing to fear. "I have stock enough for another month," he told them. "And by then the tracks will be clear. The railroad knows what it is doing." His customers nodded and purchased their flour and sugar and coffee, their faith in Harmon's judgment unshaken. He was, after all, the man who knew everything about the flow of goods into and out of Pinewood. If he said there was nothing to worry about, there was nothing to worry about. On her hillside, Miriam Caldwell heard about the missed train from Sarah, the girl from the Hill family who still visited regularly. "My pa says it is nothing," Sarah reported. "He says the trains are always late in winter." "What do you think?" Miriam asked. Sarah considered the question with the seriousness she always brought to such conversations. "I think my pa has never seen snow like this. None of us have." Miriam looked out the window of her cabin at the white landscape beyond. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight. Not the gentle flurries of a normal December, but thick, heavy sheets of white that accumulated faster than the wind could blow it away. The drifts against her fence line were already 4 feet deep, and the sky showed no sign of clearing. "I think you are right," she said. The second missed train produced unease. December 17th. The date had been circled on calendars throughout Pinewood, the date when the next shipment of goods was scheduled to arrive. Families had placed orders. Merchants had promised deliveries. The holiday season was approaching, and with it the need for special provisions. Sugar for cookies, flour for bread, coffee and tea for the gatherings that marked the darkest days of the year. December 17th came. The train did not. December 18th. No train. December 19th. No train. By December 20th, the unease had begun to sharpen into something harder. Fletcher Harmon found himself answering the same questions over and over, his patience wearing thin, his assurances growing less convincing with each repetition. "When will the train come? I do not know. Do you have enough stock?" "For now." "Yes, for now." What if it does not come before Christmas? It will come. The railroad will not abandon us. But his eyes, those small, shrewd eyes that had calculated profit and loss for so many years, had begun to show something new, something that looked in certain light like fear. The snow continued to fall. On Christmas Eve, the people of Pinewood gathered in the church for the annual service. The pews were packed, every family in town represented their faces, illuminated by candlelight and shadowed by worry. The Reverend Morrison delivered a sermon about faith in times of trial, about the importance of trusting in providence, about the example of the Holy Family who had found shelter in a stable when all doors were closed to them. His words were meant to comfort. They did not. After the service, families returned to homes that felt smaller than they had the year before. The Christmas dinners they had planned, the feasts of roasted meat and fresh bread and sweet desserts, had been scaled back. The supplies they had counted on had not arrived. The abundance they had taken for granted had revealed itself to be fragile, dependent on forces beyond their control. Miriam Caldwell did not attend the Christmas Eve service. She sat in her cabin with Maple in the stable nearby, the fire crackling in the hearth, a cup of tea made from dried herbs warming her hands. On the table before her lay a single dried apple ring, golden and fragrant, a small luxury she allowed herself on this night of nights. She thought about Samuel. She thought about the Christmases they had shared, 25 of them, each one marked by small traditions and simple pleasures. The way he had always insisted on cutting the tree himself, dragging it home through the snow, with a pride that seemed disproportionate to the accomplishment. The way he had sung carols in his off-key voice, unconcerned with the quality of the sound, caring only that the songs were sung. She missed him. The missing had not diminished with time. It had simply become familiar, a constant presence that she had learned to live alongside, the way one learns to live with an old injury that never fully heals. "Merry Christmas, Samuel," she said to the empty room. The fire crackled. The wind howled. The snow continued to fall. The new year arrived without celebration. January 1st, 1889. 47 days since the last supply train. The people of Pinewood had stopped asking when the next one would come. They had begun to ask instead how long they could last without it. Fletcher Harmon's shelves, which had entered the winter modestly stocked, were beginning to show gaps. The flour had run out first, as it always did, because flour was the foundation of every frontier kitchen. Without flour, there was no bread. Without bread, there was no substance to a meal, no feeling of fullness, no comfort in the belly against the cold. The sugar went next, then the coffee, which the loggers and mill workers depended upon, the way a preacher depends upon Scripture. The salt pork and the tinned goods and the dried beans followed in quick succession, each disappearance marking another step in the slow diminishment of civilized life. Harmon began to ration what remained. He did not announce this policy publicly. He simply began to limit purchases, telling customers that certain items were reserved for other orders, that shipments were expected any day, that it would be unfair to allow one family to buy more than its share when supplies were tight. The lies came easily at first. They became harder as the days passed and the truth became impossible to conceal. He also raised his prices, not gradually, not with the gentle escalation of normal market forces, but brutally, the way a man raises a weapon when he feels threatened. Flour that had sold for $2 a sack in November was priced at $5 by mid-January, then $8, then 12. Families who had been living comfortably discovered that comfortable was a temporary condition entirely dependent on circumstances beyond their control. Some paid the inflated prices without complaint, grateful to have money when money still mattered. Others bargained and pleaded and eventually walked away empty-handed, their faces marked with the particular humiliation of those who cannot provide for their own. A few grew angry. "You are profiting from our misery." A logger named Erickson shouted at Harmon one afternoon, his voice loud enough to be heard throughout the store. "You are bleeding us dry while we starve." Harmon's face remained impassive. "I am selling goods at the price the market will bear. If you do not wish to pay, you do not have to buy." The market. Erickson spat the word like a curse. "There is no market. There is only you. And we have no choice." "That," Harmon said quietly, "is not my fault." Erickson left without purchasing anything. That night at the saloon, he spoke loudly about what should be done to merchants who exploited their neighbors in times of crisis. His words were angry and imprecise, fueled by whiskey and fear, but they found an audience among men who shared his desperation. Nothing came of the talk. Not yet. But the anger had been planted, and it would grow. The cold deepened in the second week of January. Temperatures that had hovered near freezing dropped to 0, then below 0, then to depths that made the mercury in thermometers retreat into their bulbs and refuse to register. The wind came down from the mountains carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin and froze moisture in nostrils and lungs. Breathing became painful. Movement became dangerous. The world outside the walls of homes and cabins became hostile in a way that seemed almost personal. The snow continued to fall, not constantly but regularly, adding layer upon layer to the drifts that had already buried fences and outbuildings and the lower branches of trees. The main street of Pinewood, which had been passable in December, became a trench carved through walls of white. The paths between buildings became tunnels. The world shrank to the distance a person could walk without risking frostbite. In such conditions, information traveled slowly. It took 3 days for the news from Cascade Pass to reach Pinewood. Passed from mouth to mouth along the chain of isolated homesteads that connected the town to the wider world. The news was not good. The pass was closed. Not just difficult, not just treacherous, but closed. The snow had accumulated to depths of 30 feet in the narrowest sections, burying the railroad tracks so completely that no trace of them remained visible. The locomotives that were supposed to clear the way sat frozen on sidings 100 miles to the west, their boilers cold, their crews unable to reach them, through drifts that would have swallowed a man standing upright. The territorial governor had promised an emergency relief train. The promise had been made in a warm office in Salem by a man who had looked at maps and issued orders without understanding what those orders would require. The relief train had set out on January 8th. It had traveled 40 miles before the snow stopped it. It sat now in a small station called Willow Creek. Its crew huddled in the passenger cars for warmth, waiting for conditions to improve. Conditions were not improving. When the news reached Pinewood, it spread through the town like a fever. Families gathered in kitchens and parlors, speaking in low voices, trying to calculate how long they could last on what they had. The calculations were not encouraging. "We have flour enough for 2 weeks," one mother told her husband. "After that, I do not know." We have beans, another family concluded. Beans and potatoes. We can live on that. We have nothing, a third family admitted. Nothing but what Harmon will sell us, and Harmon's prices are beyond our reach. The hunger announced itself in stages. First, there was the tightening of meals. Portions that had been generous became modest. Modest portions became meager. Breakfast, which had once been a substantial affair of eggs and bacon and biscuits, became a cup of weak coffee and a slice of bread. Dinner, the main meal of the day, shrank from 3 courses to 2 to 1. Then there was the rationing. Mothers began to divide food with mathematical precision, measuring out portions that would stretch supplies as far as possible. A cup of flour became a quarter cup. A potato became half a potato. A strip of bacon became a memory. Then there was the hunger itself. It did not arrive suddenly. It crept in a gradual weakening that manifested first as fatigue and irritability, then as a persistent ache in the belly that no amount of water could soothe. Children grew thin. Their cheeks, which had been round and rosy in the autumn, became hollow and pale. Their eyes, which had sparkled with mischief and curiosity, became dull and distant, fixed on something that the adults could not see. The elderly grew quiet. This was perhaps the most heartbreaking change of all. The old people of Pinewood, who had survived decades of hardship and carried the wisdom of those years in their bones, began to withdraw. They ate less, spoke less, moved less. They sat in corners and watched the fire burn, conserving their energy because they did not know when they would eat again. They were preparing to die, not with drama or complaint, but with the quiet acceptance of people who understood that resources were limited and that the young must be preserved. A particular silence settled over the town, the silence of people waiting. Jasper Thornton closed the sawmill on January 15th. There was no point in keeping it open. The supply chain that brought raw timber to the mill and carried finished lumber away had been severed. The workers who operated the great saws and the planers and the finishing equipment needed food to fuel their labor, and food was becoming scarce. The market for lumber, which depended on construction projects in Portland and beyond, had frozen along with the mountain passes. "I am sorry," Thornton told his workers gathered in the mill yard on a morning so cold that their breath hung in the air like smoke. "I cannot pay you. I cannot feed you. I cannot keep the operation running. When the trains return, we will start again." The workers dispersed in silence. Some went home to families that depended on wages that would no longer come. Others went to the saloon where credit was still extended to men whose futures were uncertain. A few climbed the hills to the homesteads of relatives who had food stored and might be willing to share. Thornton himself retreated to his office and sat at his desk, staring at the maps on the walls that showed forests. He could not harvest roads. He could not use a world that had shrunk to the boundaries of a town that was slowly starving. His wife Cordelia found him there that evening. "Jasper," she said. Her voice was softer than usual, stripped of the confident authority that characterized her public presence. "What are we going to do?" He did not answer. He did not have an answer to give. The first death came on a Tuesday in early February. Ezra Finch was 73 years old. He had been a logger in his youth, a man of considerable strength and endurance, capable of felling trees from dawn to dusk and walking home afterward with energy to spare. Age had diminished his body, but not his pride. He lived alone in a small cabin on the edge of town, refusing offers of assistance, insisting that he could take care of himself as he always had. His cabin was warm when they found him. The woodpile outside was full stacked with the meticulous care of a man who understood that winter was not to be trifled with. The fire in his hearth had burned down to embers, but the room still held heat. His bed was neatly made. His few possessions were arranged with military precision on the shelves and surfaces of his modest home. His larder was empty. The shelves where food should have been held, nothing but dust, and the faint smell of provisions long since consumed. The root cellar beneath the cabin, which should have been stocked with potatoes and turnips and preserved vegetables, contained only the memory of abundance. Ezra Finch had run out of food, and he had been too proud to ask for help, and he had died in his chair by the fire, looking out the window at the snow that continued to fall. The news of his death spread through Pinewood with the peculiar velocity that bad news always achieves. "Old Ezra is gone," the people whispered. "Starved to death with a full woodpile, warm but hungry." What kind of death is that? A few suggested that his fate was his own fault. He should have asked for help. He should have swallowed his pride. He should have been more careful with his supplies in the autumn when planning still mattered. But most recognized the truth. Ezra Finch had died because the system that was supposed to sustain him had failed. The trains that should have brought food did not come. The store that should have sold provisions had priced them beyond his reach. The community that should have noticed his need had been too consumed with its own survival to pay attention. Ezra Finch had died because Pinewood had forgotten him. He would not be the last. The second death came 6 days later. The Whitfield family lived in a house near the sawmill. Jacob Whitfield had been one of Thornton's workers, a reliable man who showed up on time and did his job without complaint. His wife, Margaret, had given birth to their fourth child, a daughter, in early November, just before the trains stopped running. The baby had been sickly from the start. Born small, she had struggled to gain weight even when food was plentiful. As the winter deepened and the family's supplies dwindled, Margaret had faced an impossible choice. Feed the baby who needed milk that Margaret's own malnourished body could barely produce, or feed the 3 older children who cried with hunger and looked at their mother with eyes that broke her heart. She had tried to do both. She had given everything she had to her children, eating nothing herself, growing weaker by the day while her milk grew thinner and her baby grew more fragile. On a Tuesday night in February, the baby stopped breathing. Margaret had been holding her, singing softly a lullaby about a land where the fruit trees never stopped bearing. The melody had been passed down from her own mother, a song from the old country that spoke of abundance and warmth and plenty. She had sung it to all her children, but she had sung it most often to this little girl, who had come into the world at the worst possible time. The baby had listened to the song with her eyes half closed, her tiny hand wrapped around her mother's finger. And then, without warning, without sound, she had simply stopped. Margaret held her through the night. When Jacob woke in the morning and saw his wife in the rocking chair, the still form of their daughter in her arms, he knew before he asked. He knelt beside them and wept, and Margaret wept with him, and their 3 other children watched from the doorway with expressions too old for their young faces. They buried the baby in the cemetery behind the church in a grave they had to dig through 4 feet of frozen ground. The Reverend Morrison said the words that were meant to comfort the promises of heaven and reunion and eternal peace. His voice trembled as he spoke. He had buried many people in his years of ministry, but he had never buried a child who had died of hunger. He had never stood over a grave and wondered if his own congregation bore responsibility for what lay within it. The mourners dispersed in silence. There was nothing to say. There was only the cold and the snow and the terrible knowledge that the baby in the ground might not be the last. In her cabin on the hillside, Miriam Caldwell learned of the deaths from Sarah, who had made the difficult journey through the snow to bring the news. The girl stood in Miriam's kitchen, her face red from the cold, her eyes wet with tears she was trying not to shed. "Mr. Finch died," she said, "and the Whitfield baby. Ma says there will be more if the trains do not come soon." Miriam poured a cup of hot tea and pressed it into Sarah's hands. "Your mother is right," she said. "There will be more." Sarah looked at her with the directness that Miriam had come to appreciate. "You have food. You have 500 pounds of dried fruit. Everyone knows it." "Yes. Are you going to share it?" The question hung in the air between them. Miriam did not answer immediately. She turned to the window and looked out at the snow that lay thick upon the world, at the white landscape that seemed to have no end at the valley below where pinewood huddled against the cold and waited for salvation that was not coming. "Yes," she said, finally. "I am going to share it, but not yet." "Why not?" "Because they are not ready to receive it." Sarah frowned. "I do not understand." Miriam turned back to face her. "When I brought my apple rings to Harmon's store 3 years ago, he told me that people want what they know. Labels and brands. Proper goods from proper companies. He said my fruit was homemade and he made the word sound like an insult. But people are hungry now. They will not care about labels. No, they will not care about labels. But they still care about their pride." Miriam sat down across from Sarah and took the girl's cold hands in her own. "If I go down there now with my sledge full of dried fruit, some will accept it gratefully, but others will refuse. They will say they do not need charity from the widow in the madhouse. They will choose hunger over humiliation." Sarah considered this. "Then what are you waiting for?" "I am waiting," Miriam said, "for the hunger to become stronger than the pride." February crawled forward like a wounded animal. The days grew slightly longer, but no warmer. The snow continued to fall in irregular bursts, adding to the drifts that had already transformed Pinewood into a landscape of white walls and buried landmarks. The paths that connected houses and businesses had to be redug after every storm, and the effort of digging consumed calories that could not be replaced. The hunger that had been gnawing at the edges of the community began to bite deeper. Fletcher Harmon's shelves, which had shown gaps in January, were now almost entirely bare. The few items that remained, tins of sardines, jars of pickled vegetables, bags of rice that had sat unsold for months, were priced at levels that only the wealthiest families could afford. And even the wealthiest families were beginning to feel the pinch. Jasper Thornton, who had always considered himself above the common concerns of ordinary people, found himself staring at a pantry that held less food than his household needed. Cordelia, who had never in her life worried about where her next meal would come from, began to ration sugar and flour with the precision of a woman who had learned too late that abundance was not guaranteed. "We should have prepared better," She told her husband one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. We should have listened. Listened to whom Cordelia did not answer. But they both knew. They had both laughed at the widow on the hill with her 500 pounds of dried fruit. They had both called her mad. They had both assumed that their position in the community, their wealth, their connections would protect them from the common fate of common people. They had been wrong. The social order of Pinewood began to invert. Families who had been considered poor, who had always lived on the margins of the community's prosperity, discovered that their habits of frugality had prepared them better for scarcity than the habits of plenty that wealthier families had cultivated. The homesteaders in the hills who had always kept root cellars and dried meat and preserved vegetables against the uncertainty of mountain winters found themselves with surplus, while the merchants and mill owners in town went hungry. Cordelia Thornton, who had led the Women's Auxiliary in its decision to shun Miriam Caldwell, was seen one morning accepting a bag of dried pears from a farm wife she had barely acknowledged before. Her eyes were fixed on the ground as she took the offered charity, her face burning with shame that no amount of cold could explain. Her husband saw this and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The woman who had called Miriam's enterprise unwholesome was now dependent on the kindness of those she had looked down upon. The irony was not lost on either of them. Harmon watched from behind his counter as his empire crumbled. The mercantile that had been the heart of Pinewood, the center of commerce and gossip and community life, stood nearly empty now. The shelves that had groaned with goods from Portland held dust and memories. The customers who had once lined up to purchase his merchandise now avoided his store either because they could not afford his prices or because they had nothing left to buy. He had made a fortune during the early weeks of the crisis selling flour at $12 a sack to families desperate enough to pay any price. But fortunes in currency meant nothing when there was nothing to purchase. The bills in his safe, hundreds of dollars accumulated through months of exploitation, had become as worthless as the schedules printed in Portland that promised trains which never came. He began to eat his own stock. The sardines he had priced at $2 a tin he opened for his breakfast. The rice he had sold for $1 a pound he boiled for his dinner. The pickled vegetables he had displayed like treasures he consumed in the evening, while his wife, a thin woman named Edith, who had never questioned his business practices, watched with hollow eyes. "Is this what it comes to?" she asked him one night. "We sell everything at prices no one can pay, and then we eat what no one bought." Harmon did not answer. He was thinking about the widow on the hill, the woman he had dismissed and demeaned, the woman who had 500 pounds of food stored while his shelves stood empty. He was thinking about what he would say to her when the time came to ask for help. On the last day of February, Miriam walked to her drying shed. The snow had stopped falling the night before, and the morning sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks, casting long shadows across the white landscape. The air was still and cold, so cold that each breath crackled in her lungs. But the stillness had a quality of anticipation, as if the world was holding its breath. She opened the door of the shed and stepped inside. The shelves that lined the walls held her harvest. 512 pounds of dried fruit, packed in cloth sacks and sealed wooden boxes organized by type and date. The work of 3 years. The labor of 1,000 hours. The knowledge passed down from her mother and her grandmother from women who had understood that summer does not last, and that the only provision you can truly depend upon is the one you make with your own hands. She walked slowly along the shelves, touching the boxes, reading the labels she had written in her careful script. Apples, 1886. Plums, 1887. Pears, 1888. Cherries, huckleberries, blackberries. The berry cakes she had learned to make, dense and nourishing, capable of sustaining a working man through a day of labor, on a handful. They had called her mad for this. They had laughed at her, mocked her, excluded her from their society. They had named her Shed the Widow's Madhouse and congratulated themselves on their wit. And now they were dying. Old Ezra alone in his cabin with an empty larder. The Whitfield baby fading away while her mother sang songs about abundance that did not exist. Others would follow. Miriam knew this with the certainty that comes from understanding human nature and the mathematics of starvation. The food in Pinewood was running out. The trains were not coming. Without intervention, more people would die. She could let them. The thought surfaced unbidden, a dark whisper from the wounded part of her heart that remembered every slight, every insult, every cruel joke made at her expense. She could let them starve, these people who had called her mad. She could sit in her cabin with her 500 pounds of fruit and watch the town below consume itself. She could have the revenge that some part of her, some small and bitter part, had imagined during the lonely nights of the past 3 years. She closed her eyes and thought of Samuel. She thought of his final words, whispered with the last of his strength. Forgive the tree. He had not been talking about the tree. He had been talking about the world, about the random cruelty of existence, about the choice that every wounded soul must make between bitterness and grace. She opened her eyes and looked at her harvest. Then she walked to the stable where Copper stood in her stall, the sorrel mare that had been her companion through 3 years of labor and loneliness. The horse looked up as she entered, ears pricked forward, intelligent eyes assessing her mood. "Well, old girl," Miriam said, pressing her forehead against the mare's warm neck. "I suppose they will be coming round soon." She allowed herself one moment of weariness, one moment to feel the weight of what she was about to do, the enormity of feeding a town that had treated her with contempt, the exhaustion that would come from weeks of labor in the cold and the snow. Then she straightened her spine, squared her shoulders, and began to load the sledge. It was time. Miriam heard about the deaths on a Wednesday morning. The news came from Sarah, the Hill family's youngest daughter, who had made the difficult journey down through the snow to bring word of what was happening in the valley below. The girl's face was thinner than Miriam remembered the roundness of childhood, giving way to the sharp angles that hunger carved into young flesh. But her eyes were the same, bright and observant, taking in everything. "Mr. Finch is dead," Sarah said, standing in Miriam's doorway with snow melting on her shoulders. "They found him yesterday, and the Whitfield baby. She passed 3 days ago." Miriam had known Ezra Finch only by sight, a retired logger who lived alone in a cabin on the edge of town. She had never spoken to him, never had cause to. But she had seen him at Harmon's store once, buying tobacco and coffee with the careful movements of a man who measured every penny. He had nodded to her, a brief acknowledgement from one solitary person to another. Now he was dead, starved in a cabin with a full woodpile and an empty larder. The baby she had not known at all. The Whitfields were a young couple who had arrived in Pinewood the same year as Miriam, full of hope and plans that the frontier had slowly ground down to survival. Their daughter had been born in December, a Christmas baby the town had called her, a blessing in dark times. The blessing had lasted 7 weeks. Miriam listened to Sarah's account of the town below, the empty shelves at Harmon's store, the families who had stopped coming outside because they lacked the strength to walk, the silence that had settled over Pinewood, the silence of people conserving their energy because they did not know when they would eat again. She listened, and she made her decision. It was not a difficult decision. It was not even in any meaningful sense a decision at all. It was simply the recognition of what she had always known she would do, what she had been preparing to do for 3 years, what her mother and grandmother had prepared her to do across 3 generations of women who understood that knowledge carried with it responsibility. She had food. They did not. The equation was that simple. "Wait here," she told Sarah. "Warm yourself by the fire. I will need your help." She walked to the drying shed, her boots crunching through the frozen crust of snow that covered the hillside. The morning sun struck the cedar shakes of the roof, turning them gold and amber. Inside, the air was cold but dry, the carefully controlled environment that had preserved her harvest through autumn and into winter. She opened the door and surveyed her stores. The shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, holding what no store in Pinewood could offer. Cloth sacks and sealed wooden boxes, each one labeled in her careful handwriting with the contents and the date. Apples dried to supple leather, pears halved and honeyed, plums transformed into dense, dark prunes, cherries reduced to jewel-like morsels, berry cakes wrapped in waxed cloth, dense with nourishment. 512 pounds. 3 years of labor, 3 years of mockery, 3 years of patient accumulation, while the town below laughed and whispered and called her mad. She ran her hand along the nearest shelf, feeling the rough texture of the cloth sacks beneath her fingers. Then she began to load the sledge. Copper stood waiting in the stable, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. The mare was old now, 19 years by Miriam's count, but still strong enough for the work ahead. Miriam had kept her fed through the winter on hay she had stockpiled the previous autumn, the same foresight that had filled her shed with fruit, now keeping her horse alive while others in the valley had already begun slaughtering their livestock for food. She harnessed Copper to the wooden sledge and loaded it with 100 pounds of dried fruit. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, berry cakes. A careful selection designed to provide variety and balanced nutrition. Then she added a sack of dried venison that one of the Hill families had traded her in the autumn, and a basket of potatoes from her root cellar, and the last of the eggs her chickens had laid before the cold stopped their production. Sarah watched from the cabin doorway. "You are taking it to them," she said. "It was not a question. I am. They laughed at you. My pa told me." The whole town laughed. Miriam tightened the straps that held the load in place. "Yes," she said, "they did. And you are still going to feed them." Miriam straightened and looked at the girl. "What would your mother do?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The same thing." "Then you have answered your own question." She led Copper down the hill, the sledge runners hissing through the snow. Sarah walked beside her, helping to steady the load on the steeper sections, where the sledge wanted to slide sideways. The sun climbed higher, and the valley below emerged from shadow. And Miriam saw for the first time the full extent of what the winter had done. Pinewood looked abandoned. The main street, usually busy with the traffic of loggers and farmers, and townspeople going about their daily business, was empty. Smoke rose from only half the chimneys, and even that smoke was thin and sparse, the product of rationed fuel rather than roaring fires. The sawmill stood silent, its great blade still, its yard empty of the logs that usually filled it. Even the saloon, which had been the social heart of the town, showed no signs of life. But it was the general store that told the true story. Harmon's Mercantile, which had once displayed its abundance in windows crowded with goods, now showed nothing but empty shelves. The windows themselves were dark, as if the building had been abandoned. The sign that read, "Everything you need," hung at a slight angle, one of its chains having rusted through and broken. Miriam stopped the sledge directly in front of the store. She had thought about this moment many times during the long winter nights. She had imagined how she would feel, standing in the spot where Fletcher Harmon had refused to let her sell her fruit 3 years ago. She had expected to feel vindication perhaps, or satisfaction, or the grim pleasure of being proven right. She felt none of those things. She felt only the weight of work to be done. She unhitched Copper and tied her to the hitching post. She unloaded the planks and sawhorses she had brought and assembled them into a makeshift table. She arranged her goods on the table, the dried fruit in neat rows, the potatoes in a basket, the venison in its cloth wrapping. And then she waited. The first to approach was a boy. He came around the corner of the general store, moving slowly, as if walking required more effort than he could spare. He was perhaps 10 years old, his face gaunt beneath a wool cap that was too large for his shrunken head. His clothes hung on his frame like garments borrowed from a larger person, and his eyes, when they found the table full of food, went wide with something that looked like fear. Miriam understood that fear. It was the fear of hope. The fear that this abundance might be an illusion, a cruel trick of a starving mind, and that reaching for it would shatter the dream and leave him with nothing but the reality of his hunger. She spoke gently. "Come here, child." The boy did not move. He stared at the dried fruit as if it might vanish if he looked away. "It is real," Miriam said, "and it is for you. Take as much as you need. There is no charge." The boy looked at her, then truly looked at her, and she saw the moment when he recognized her. The widow from the hill, the crazy woman with the drying shed, the subject of 1,000 jokes and whispered comments. He had probably laughed at those jokes himself, or at least heard his parents laugh at them. Now he was standing before her, hungry enough to set aside whatever pride remained to him, and she was offering him food without conditions, without payment, without even the requirement that he acknowledge the irony of his position. His hands trembled as he reached for the dried apple rings. He grabbed 2 fistfuls more than he could hold, and some of the rings fell to the ground. He looked at Miriam with panic in his eyes, as if he expected her to snatch the food away. "Take what fell as well," she said, "and there is more when that is gone." The boy stuffed the apple rings into his mouth, eating so fast that he barely chewed. Then he grabbed more, cramming them into his pockets, his shirt, anywhere they would fit. And then he ran. Miriam watched him go. She did not call after him. She did not remind him to share with his family, or to pace himself, or to be grateful. She simply let him go, carrying with him the first delivery of what would become a daily ritual. Within the hour, word had spread. They came in ones and twos at first, then in groups. Mothers with children balanced on their hips, the children too weak to walk. Fathers with the shame of hungry men written on their weathered faces, the shame of providers who could not provide. Elderly couples supporting each other, moving slowly through the cold toward a table piled with sweetness. Miriam distributed her stores with calm efficiency. She measured portions by family size, ensuring that each household received enough to last a week. She showed them how to reconstitute the dried fruit in warm water, how to simmer it into a thick compote that stretched further and satisfied longer than eating it dry. She demonstrated her berry cakes, explaining that a single cake the size of a man's palm contained enough nourishment for a day of hard labor. She did not lecture. She did not remind them of their mockery. She did not say, "I told you so," or "you should have listened," or any of the other phrases that a lesser person might have used to twist the knife of vindication. She simply fed them, and they ate. Fletcher Harmon appeared at the door of his empty store around midday. He stood in the doorway watching the line of people that stretched from Miriam's table down the street. His face was thinner than it had been in the autumn, the red beard less full, the small, shrewd eyes less bright. He had been eating better than most, Miriam suspected, hoarding whatever personal stores he had managed to accumulate. But even he had felt the bite of the winter, the endless days of diminishing resources and rising desperation. He watched for a long time without speaking. His expression shifted as the minutes passed, moving through a landscape of emotions that Miriam could read as easily as she read the weather. Resentment came first, the instinctive response of a man whose monopoly had been broken. Then confusion as he tried to understand what she was doing and why. Then something that might have been shame, though she could not be certain. She did not acknowledge him. She did not need to. When the last person in line had received their portion, Miriam began packing up her table. Harmon was still standing in his doorway, still watching. As she loaded the empty sacks onto her sledge, he spoke. "Mrs. Caldwell." She looked up. He seemed to struggle with something, some internal resistance that made the words difficult. Finally, he said, "How much? How much what? How much for the fruit?" Miriam straightened. "There is no charge." Harmon's brow furrowed. "Nothing is free, Mrs. Caldwell. What do you want in exchange? I want nothing. Everyone wants something." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes held no anger, no triumph, no contempt. Only a weariness that went deeper than the physical fatigue of the morning's work. "I want what I have always wanted," she said. "To make summer last through winter. That is all." She turned back to her sledge, and Harmon did not speak again. She returned the next day with another 100 pounds, and the next, and the next. For 5 weeks, Miriam Caldwell fed Pinewood. She rose before dawn each morning, loaded her sledge with careful selections from her stores, and drove Copper down the frozen hill to the town below. She set up her table in the same spot each day, directly in front of Harmon's empty mercantile, and she distributed her harvest to whoever came. The dried fruit proved more sustaining than anyone had expected. It was dense with sugar and fiber, and the concentrated essence of summer. Children who ate it regained their color within days, the gray pallor of starvation giving way to the pink of returning health. Adults who had grown listless and weak found their strength returning, found themselves able to walk without trembling, to work without collapsing, to hope without despair. The berry cakes became legendary. Miriam had developed the recipe over 3 years of experimentation, pressing dried berries into dense cakes that could be wrapped in waxed cloth and stored indefinitely. Each cake was the size of a man's palm and weighed almost nothing, but it packed enough nourishment to sustain a grown man through a day of hard labor. The mill workers who had been too weak to lift their tools found that a single berry cake in the morning allowed them to work until noon. 2 cakes carried them through the entire day. Word spread beyond Pinewood. The Hill families who had been surviving on their own stores and whatever game they could trap heard about the widow's relief operation and came down to see for themselves. Some of them brought what little they could spare to contribute dried meat or root vegetables or preserved fish. Miriam accepted these offerings and added them to her distribution, sharing everything equally among those who came. She kept careful records in her ledger. Each day she noted how much she had distributed, how many families had been served what remained in her stores. The numbers told a story of calculated generosity of resources measured against need of a woman who understood that helping others required not just good intentions, but good management. By the end of February, she had distributed 340 pounds of dried fruit. 172 pounds remained. It would be enough. She knew this not through hope, but through calculation. The worst of the winter was past. The days were growing longer, the sun stronger. The snow in the passes would begin to melt within weeks, and the trains would run again. She needed only to stretch her remaining stores until then. She could do it. She would do it. The town began to change. It was not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden conversion from mockery to reverence. It was something subtler, something that happened in small moments and quiet gestures that most people did not even notice. The whispers stopped. At first, Miriam did not register the absence. She had grown so accustomed to the constant hum of gossip that surrounded her that its disappearance was like the cessation of a sound she had stopped hearing long ago. But gradually she became aware that people were looking at her differently, not with the sidelong glances and suppressed smirks of the past 3 years, but with something else, something that looked like respect. People began to speak to her, not just the desperate souls who came to her table for food, but others. The blacksmith who had never acknowledged her existence nodded to her on the street. The minister who had preached sermons about the dangers of isolation tipped his hat as she passed. Even the women of the auxiliary who had declared her eccentric and possibly unwholesome began to offer tentative greetings. Cordelia Thornton did not greet her. Jasper Thornton's wife had been conspicuously absent from the distribution table, sending servants to collect her family's portion rather than appearing herself. It was a final gesture of pride, a refusal to acknowledge that she had been wrong, that the woman she had mocked and excluded was now the only thing standing between her family and starvation. But one morning near the end of February, Cordelia appeared. She came alone without servants. without the entourage of women who usually accompanied her through town. She wore a dress that had seen better days, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, and the hem showing signs of repeated mending. Her face was pale and drawn, and her hands trembled slightly as she approached the table. Miriam said nothing. She simply measured out a portion of dried pears, the same portion she gave to everyone, and placed it in Cordelia's hands. Cordelia looked at the pears. Then she looked at Miriam. Her lips moved, forming words that would not come. Whatever she wanted to say, gratitude or apology or something else entirely, it stuck in her throat and would not be spoken. Miriam understood. Some debts were too large for words. "Go home," she said gently. "Feed your family. That is all that matters now." Cordelia nodded a single sharp jerk of her head and walked away. She did not look back, but Miriam saw just before Cordelia turned the corner a single tear tracking down her cheek. The train came on March 9th. It came through the pass with a roar of steam and a scream of whistles. The first sound of the outside world that Pinewood had heard in 96 days. The locomotive was blackened with soot and scored with scratches from the debris it had pushed aside. But it was there. It was real. It was the proof that the world had not forgotten them after all. The town greeted it with a relief that bordered on hysteria. People who had not left their cabins in weeks stumbled into the street to watch the train pull into the station. They wept and embraced and shouted with joy. They mobbed the rail cars before they had even stopped moving, desperate to see the goods that would finally fill the empty shelves and the empty bellies. But even in the midst of celebration, there was a reckoning that could not be postponed. A gathering was called for the following Sunday to be held in the church, because it was the largest building in town, and because the occasion seemed to demand the gravity of sacred ground. The minister announced it from the pulpit, and the word spread quickly through the community. Every surviving resident would attend. Miriam was not certain she would go. She had done what she set out to do. She had fed the town through the worst of the winter, had kept people alive until the supply train could reach them. She had no need of public acknowledgement, no desire for gratitude or apology or vindication. She had simply done what her mother would have done, what her grandmother would have done, what any woman with knowledge and resources and a conscience would have done. But Sarah appeared at her cabin on Saturday afternoon, breathless from the climb up the hill. "You have to come," the girl said. "The whole town is talking about it. They want to thank you properly." "I do not need thanks." "It is not about what you need," Sarah said. "It is about what they need." Miriam considered this. Then she nodded. The church was full when she arrived. Every pew was occupied, every aisle crowded with people who could not find seats. The minister stood at the front looking uncertain, as if he had lost control of his own congregation. Which, in a sense, he had. This gathering was not about God or salvation or the usual concerns of a Sunday service. It was about something more immediate, more earthly, more human. It was about a woman and a shed full of dried fruit. Fletcher Harmon was the first to speak. He walked to the front of the assembly with the heavy steps of a man approaching a gallows. His face was pale, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he reached the pulpit, he turned to face the congregation. and Miriam saw something she had never expected to see on Fletcher Harmon's face. Fear. He was afraid. Afraid of the words he was about to speak, afraid of the public admission they would require, afraid of the man he would reveal himself to have been. 3 years ago, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, a woman came to my store. He paused, swallowed, continued. She brought a sample of dried fruit, apple rings. She had made them herself in a shed on the hillside above this town. She asked only that I allow her to set up a table outside my store on market days. She would handle her own sales. I would simply allow her to use the space. Another pause. The congregation was utterly silent. I refused her. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their consequence. I told her that people wanted proper goods from proper companies. I told her that homemade fruit was beneath the standards of my establishment. I told her that her presence would give the wrong impression. Harmon's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and forced himself to continue. For 3 years, I told anyone who would listen that the widow on the hill was mad. I made jokes about her 500 pounds of fruit. I laughed at her ambition and her methods and her solitary existence. My shelves were full, and her shed was foolishness, and I was certain I was right. He looked up finally, and his eyes found Miriam in the crowd. My shelves have been empty for 3 months. My store has held nothing but dust and shame. And the woman I refused, the woman I mocked, the woman this town called mad. That woman fed your families when I could not. His voice broke entirely. Tears ran down his cheeks, catching in his red beard. She fed my family, my wife and my children, though I gave her every reason to let us go hungry. Though I earned nothing but her contempt, she fed us anyway. He turned to face Miriam directly. Mrs. Caldwell, I was wrong. About your fruit, about your methods, about you. I am a merchant who had nothing to sell. You are a woman who had everything to give. I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I ask for it nonetheless. He bowed his head and stepped down from the pulpit. Jasper Thornton rose next. The mill owner moved slowly as if his body had aged decades in the past 3 months. His clothes hung loosely on a frame that had lost its prosperous bulk, and his face showed the hollows that hunger had carved. He did not go to the pulpit. He stood in the aisle facing the congregation, his voice rough with emotion. My wife told her circle that Mrs. Caldwell's operation was unwholesome, he said. My wife told the women of this town that the widow's shed was a health concern, that no respectable woman would buy fruit dried in an open-air structure where birds and insects had free access. He shook his head slowly. My wife ate Mrs. Caldwell's pears last month. She ate them and she wept, because they tasted like summer, and she had forgotten what summer tasted like. His voice dropped lower. I called Mrs. Caldwell's enterprise a sad little project, born of a sad little life. I laughed at the idea of 500 pounds of dried fruit. I said she would be buried in prunes before she was buried in the ground. He looked at Miriam, and his eyes were wet. I was describing my own character, Mrs. Caldwell, not yours. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. He sat down heavily as if the confession had drained the last of his strength. Others spoke. The mothers who had watched their children's color return after eating Miriam's fruit. The loggers whose strength had been sustained by her berry cakes. The elderly who had survived because a woman they had never spoken to had thought of them anyway. One by one they rose and bore witness. Some wept. Some could barely speak. All of them carried the weight of gratitude and shame in equal measure. The recognition that they had been wrong about something fundamental that they had mocked. What they should have admired and dismissed. What they should have learned from. When the confessions had run their course, the church fell silent, and Miriam Caldwell stood. She was not a tall woman, but something in the way she held herself straight-backed, clear-eyed, unhurried, gave her a presence that filled the room. She walked to the front of the church without haste, her footsteps echoing in the silence. When she reached the pulpit, she turned to face the congregation, and she waited until every eye was on her before she spoke. "My mother taught me to dry fruit." Her voice was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the church. Her mother taught her. My grandmother learned the art in the hill country of Tennessee, where preserving food was not a hobby but a matter of life and death. She carried that knowledge across 1,000 miles of wilderness through hardship and loss and grief that would have broken lesser women. She passed it to her daughter, who passed it to me. She paused, letting the words settle. I did not dry 500 pounds of fruit to prove a point. I did not stockpile food to spite this town or to prepare for some catastrophe I alone could foresee. I dried fruit because it is what my family has always done. I stored it because waste offends me. Every autumn fruit falls from the trees around this valley and rots on the ground. Perfectly good food left to the worms and the weather, while this community trusts its survival to a railroad schedule printed in Portland by men who have never spent a winter here. She looked around the church, meeting the eyes of those who had mocked her, those who had ignored her, those who had eaten her food and wept with gratitude. "I am not angry with any of you." The words fell like a benediction. Mockery is the sound that people make when they do not understand something. It is easier to laugh than to ask questions. It is easier to dismiss than to learn. You did not know what I knew, and so you judged what you could not comprehend. Now you understand. She straightened and her voice grew stronger. And if you wish to learn, I will teach you. The fruit is there for the taking. The sun is free. The knowledge is simple. No family in this valley need ever go hungry again if they are willing to do the work. She stepped down from the pulpit and walked back to her seat. Behind her, the church erupted in applause. That summer, 11 drying sheds appeared on the hillsides around Pinewood. Each one was built under Miriam's patient instruction. She taught the women and more than a few of the men the art her mother and grandmother had perfected. She showed them how to select fruit at its peak of ripeness, how to prepare it for drying, how to regulate heat and airflow, how to store the finished product for years if necessary. She did not charge for these lessons. She did not ask for compensation or recognition or gratitude. She simply shared what she knew the way her mother had shared it with her, the way her grandmother had shared it before that. Knowledge, she understood, was not diminished by sharing. It was multiplied. Fletcher Harmon added a dried fruit section to his mercantile. He stocked it exclusively with locally produced goods, displayed prominently near the front of the store. A hand-lettered sign above the display read, "Pinewood's Finest, prepared by our own. He charged a fair price and paid his suppliers fairly in return. It was, he admitted to Miriam one afternoon, the most honest business he had ever conducted. Cordelia Thornton became one of Miriam's most devoted students. The woman who had called her unwholesome and eccentric now spent her autumn afternoons on Miriam's porch, slicing fruit and learning techniques that had been passed down through 3 generations. She had a natural talent for the work patient and precise, and within 2 years, she was producing dried pears that Miriam herself declared equal to her own. They never spoke of the past. They never acknowledged the years of mockery and exclusion. But something had grown between them, something that looked like friendship, if you did not examine it too closely. And they both understood that some wounds healed better when left alone. The phrase "filling the shed" became common wisdom in Pinewood. It meant preparing for hardship during times of ease, preserving today's abundance against tomorrow's scarcity. It was spoken with quiet conviction, as if the speaker had learned its meaning through experience that left no room for doubt. Fill the shed, mothers told their daughters. Fill the shed, wives told their husbands. Fill the shed, the minister began to say from his pulpit, though he had the grace to acknowledge where the phrase had come from and who had taught its meaning to them all. Years passed. The winter of 1888 to 1889 faded from immediate memory into the realm of legend. The children who had been fed by Miriam's fruit grew up and had children of their own, and they told the story to those children. And the story changed with each telling, becoming larger and stranger and more wondrous. The widow who had saved the town with 500 pounds of dried fruit. The madwoman who had been the only sane person among them. The shed on the hillside that had held the key to survival when everything else failed. Miriam continued her work. She dried fruit every autumn until her hands grew too stiff and her eyes too weak for the precise work that preservation required. She taught everyone who wanted to learn, and some who did not know. They wanted to learn until she showed them what knowledge could do. She lived simply asking nothing of the town that had once mocked her, and now revered her content with her cabin and her shed and her memories. Copper, her mare, died in the spring of 1906. The horse had been old when Miriam bought her, and older still when the harsh winter tested both their endurance. But Copper had lived another 17 years carrying Miriam up and down the hillside, pulling the sledge that had saved a town waiting patiently on cold mornings while her mistress loaded supplies for distribution. Miriam buried her near the drying shed in a sunny spot where the grass grew green in summer and the snow drifted deep in winter. She did not mark the grave with a stone, but she knew where it was, and she visited it often, standing in silence with her hand pressed against the earth. She lived another 10 years after that. In her final years, Miriam rarely left the hillside. Her strength had faded, though her mind remained sharp, and she spent her days sitting on her porch, watching the valley below, remembering. She remembered Samuel, whose death had brought her to this place. She remembered her mother Ruth, whose knowledge had given her the tools to survive. She remembered her grandmother, whose journey from Tennessee had begun a chain of transmission that stretched across generations and geography. And she remembered the winter, the hunger in children's eyes, the weight of dried fruit on her sledge, the moment when Fletcher Harmon, who had refused her everything, bowed his head and asked her forgiveness. She had given it. Of course she had given it. What else could she do? Hatred was a weight that only the one who carried it felt. Forgiveness was not a gift to the forgiven. It was a gift to oneself. Miriam Caldwell died on a morning in April of 1916. She was 75 years old. The spring sun was streaming through her cabin window, warming her face. And somewhere outside, a bird was singing the first songs of the season. She closed her eyes, and she thought of Samuel asking her to forgive the tree, and she thought of her mother teaching her to slice apples, and she thought of 512 pounds of fruit that had fed a town. And then she did not think anymore. They buried her beside Samuel in the cemetery overlooking the valley. The funeral was the largest Pinewood had ever seen. People came from the hill farms and the logging camps and towns 20 miles away. People who had eaten her fruit during the long winter. People whose children had survived because of her foresight. People who had never met her but had heard the stories and wanted to pay their respects. Fletcher Harmon, old now and stooped, stood at the graveside with tears running down his face. Jasper Thornton, who had survived his wife by 3 years, leaned on a cane and spoke quietly to those around him about the lesson he had learned too late. And Sarah, the Hill family's daughter who had grown into a woman with children of her own, placed a handful of dried apple rings on the coffin before it was lowered into the ground. The drying shed still stands. The cedar shakes have been replaced 3 times. The racks have been rebuilt twice. The stone hearth has been repointed and repaired so often that almost none of the original stones remain. But the structure is Miriam's. The dimensions, the orientation, the careful design that catches the morning sun and channels the afternoon breeze. The families who maintain it follow her methods precisely as their parents followed them, as their grandparents learned them from a widow on a hillside who knew the value of patience. Above the door in letters carved by a hand that knew more about fruit than about carpentry is an inscription. Miriam placed it there in 1890, the year after the famine. The letters are worn now, softened by a century of weather, but still legible if you know where to look and what to look for. 2 sentences, 7 words, the summation of a life and a legacy and a lesson that each generation must learn anew. Summer forgets, the shed remembers.